Day 718 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 395,000 military personnel losses, which represents an additional 790 in the past day. Then as for their hardware losses, 10 tanks, 21 APVs and 6 artillery. Then we'll move back across to the map now, and we'll start out in the Donbass, more specifically in the southern Donetsk region, as Russian forces are near to completing a massive 30-kilometer long, or about 20-mile long, barrier out of train cars dubbed the Tsar train. Now, this construction, visible in satellite images and reported throughout Ukrainian telegram channels, extends from Oligarchs in the north there to Volnovakha at the junction point in the south, and consists of over 2,100 freight cars, and being positioned about 6 kilometers or 4 miles from the current front lines at its closest point. The barrier is thought to be a defensive measure against Ukrainian forces, which therefore represents a new tactic in Russia's defense strategy in the occupied territories, ultimately to make it too challenging for Ukrainian forces to overcome. So that, and obviously Russia has its concerns about the AFU traveling all the way down south to cut off the Russian land bridge to Zaporizhia and of course Crimea. Then we'll head across to Avdiivka, certainly a lot of activity there today, and we'll start out on the northern flank, as the Russian forces are attempting to approach the town's supply artery that's just south of the coke and chemical plant, which could complicate logistics and the ability to reinforce Ukrainian troops, leading to a potential operational encirclement later on down the track. So for Ukrainian forces to remain in this battle, they will be forced to somewhat utilize off-road land routes in and out of the town, which is not dissimilar to how they responded during the Battle of Bakhmut. Then, on the topic of encirclements, Russia is looking to perform the same maneuver on a smaller scale in the south, between Opitne and southern Avdiivka, as Russian forces have kept on to their 19 rubbled houses that Putin flaunted the capture of from a couple of weeks ago, as the Russian ground troops have now made a smaller advance just south of said region, and now of course looking to bridge that gap, which, taking a look at it from the distance or ruler perspective, about 1.5 kilometers, roughly a mile. So ultimately, delays in Western security systems and indeed the slow ramping up of artillery shell production, which will certainly have its impact on this region as it pertains to the AFU, as this location would otherwise be quite the target-rich environment as it pertains to the use of artillery shells. And if we zoom out for just a hot second and move quite north, you can see all of that green just nearby Bakhmut that actually resulted from, and I'm reminded of this, so that resulted from the Ukrainian counterattacks after the Wagner meat waves last year, after those ones dissipated. And you know what, we do call Avdiivka a Bakhmut 2.0, so hey, perhaps it is. And interestingly, for this region, Russian war tech bloggers colorfully described the FPV drone problem they face in Avdiivka right now, and say how it's a quote-unquote natural selection situation for Russian personnel stationed here. And that might be all good and well for the Ukrainian defenders, but there really is nothing like good old-fashioned artillery shells for this location right now, being as to how precarious the situation looks. And by the end of the year, and even mid-year, this won't be anywhere near as much of a crutch for the AFU in terms of artillery shell stocks, with Europe scaling up production to up to 1.5 million shells produced per annum and reaching that goal by the end of this year, with the States doing, roughly speaking, about the same amount. But having said that, and based on past events, we cannot expect a completely imminent collapse of the Ukrainian front lines here, at least at this stage. But also, it should be noted, since Russia consolidated mid-wave regiments just behind these front lines and waited for the ground to freeze here to make these types of endless forward assault offensives, we must now take a look at the weather in the region. So, as you can see here, more often than not, temperatures are typically above freezing point of 0 degrees Celsius, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, if the region constantly finds itself in warmer, muddy Rasbutitsa weather, then this is difficult for any army to contend with. But for an army attempting forward push operations, then that becomes exceedingly difficult to wrestle with. Then, somewhere in the east, 2 Russian tanks were destroyed, and one ended up with quite the large boom factor, with both of these events, in fact, occurring right in the thick of it in southern Avdiivka. Then, somewhere in the southeast, Ukrainian forces using the British donated AS-90 self-propelled artillery systems hit and destroyed an armored vehicle of Russian forces in Novodonetsk. Then, in something of a similar fashion, as we move to the Kherson Oblast, as 182,000 of the tungsten fragments, otherwise known as the M30A1 GIMLARS rockets fired from a HIMARS, detonated a few feet above a group of parked Russian logistical trucks here in the south, just beyond, a little bit north of Radensk. In fact, pretty well right on what I used to call or refer to as the Oinky Pigs, which is really just an accumulation of Russian troops in the region. And therefore also a location of which is the main arterial road leading north that by and large supports the Russian offensive operations in this area. Then we move to Odessa as footage from Ukrainian forces emerged, showing the downing of a Russian Shahed attack drone. And there are many platforms that could be used for this application, be it smaller arms fire or Gepards, NASAMs, Manpads, S300s, you name it. But in this instance, it does appear that it was the first onboard footage released showing a US-supplied Vampire SAM system in Ukrainian service, downing the Russian drone with its laser-guided missile. Then moving across to some hardware news updates for the day. So Ukraine is already set to once again enhance its naval capabilities with an upgraded version of the Magura V5 unmanned maritime drone, which will encompass versatility in functions such as including surveillance, reconnaissance, patrolling, search and rescue, demining, security, and of course, combat operations. Now, Ukraine's digital transformation minister, Fedorov, hinted at the innovation, stating, quote, "While we can't reveal it, there's a boat that's being equipped for new missions packed with fresh surprises." Plus, during the interview, Fedorov also made the comment about the Beaver UAV drones as displayed in the background, stating that they were the first to be used for long-range missions deep inside of Russia, and then went on to state in a pretty badass moment, if I do say so myself, that those Russian oil depots do not explode by themselves. Then moving across to a bit of a Russian hardware news update, if you will, as the Ukrainian military intelligence hackers launched another cyber assault on the Russian armed forces, effectively rendering all Russian DJI drones used at the front lines as inoperable. As such, reports of the drones becoming non-functional started emerging among Russian troops via Telegram, indicating a significant impact on their drone capacity and capabilities. You see, by contrast for Ukraine, the AFU is very anal about what frequencies their drones use, and they also perform frequency hopping and encryption and backup line frequencies for redundancy. Whereas Russia, on the other hand, more so have catching up to do on this front, where their Chinese-supplied stock-level DJI drones are inherently more susceptible to jamming and rendering them useless. Such a pity. Then in some other news, Estonia will continue to build a line of defense on the border with Russia, despite Putin's statements about his lack of intentions to attack NATO countries. as he seemed to sort of say in his recent interview with Tucker Carlson. And all of this was confirmed with Estonia's defense minister stating, quote, "We will not change our plans just because Putin gave an interview." All of which is a pretty fair move, or a mature move, fair assessment of the events, as Russian foreign policy time and time again simply involves lies and deception at its very own institutional level. Then moving across to another Russian military mobilization blunder segment, or adjacent segment, as a Nepali lawmaker has recently stated that 14 to 15,000 Nepalis fight in Ukraine for Russia, as Russia seeks to keep its war machine going. And as Russian losses grow, the Kremlin dangles the carrot of upfront payments and a fast track to citizenship, that's Russian citizenship, for its foreign soldiers. Then it was also noted that after the Nepali government became aware of these dealings, Nepal asked Russia to stop recruiting its citizens just back in December time. Then a local ring was found sending Nepali youths to fight for Russia, causing Nepal to stop worker permits for Russia on January the 5th, due to the casualties they then became aware of. And as it so happens, Nepalis can only legally join Indian or British armies. True story. But still, it's not surprising that something like this has happened, which is just another example of one of the latest attempts of the Russian MOD for recruiting from wherever they can globally on an industrial scale, if they could. As the promise of upfront perks to the citizens of other nations, not to mention the promise of large, tasty, big monthly salaries, dangled alongside there too, that the Russian Defense Ministry never ends up paying. I mean, they don't even pay most of their own Russian soldiers, let alone the internationals. But over time, as we've seen, nations such as Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and now Nepal are cracking down on such Russian ventures, which thereby, over time, enforces a dwindling effect on Russia's numbers-based meat wave tactics that they employ quite a bit. But here's a question for you. So given the language barrier, how is someone from Nepal going to even understand the orders from a Russian commander? Well, there is a number of methods to do this, but at the end of the day, they're usually communicating to one another purely by English. Then moving across to a super quick funny to round it all off today, guys. So after the Vladimir Putin interview with Tucker Carlson the other day, some prominent individuals from within China evidently had been watching the interview as well, which has seemed to have had the unintended consequence of some of the Chinese reigniting their conversations that more or less state something along the lines of, okay, based on Putin's historical narrative, whether real or imagined, his logic dictates that we can take back former Chinese lands in the east, such as Vladivostok or Chinese Manchuria. Oh dear, Putin might come to regret opening that can of worms. But hey, I mean, choose any date in history like the 15th century, and it would in fact appear that Lithuania has the biggest beef to pick with Russia right now. In fact, pick any date in history and we could do this all day. So that will be it for today, guys. Should be in tomorrow with a shorter video, but still do one there. Yeah, thanks again for watching. Thanks for all of your support. And yeah, continue to like and comment. And I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.